What if, in entering into those conversations where we disagree, instead of entering with statements and arguments and getting angry, we enter into those places where we disagree with questions? Tell me more.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth Afternoon Light Live for 2026. Well, Robert Menzies understood something fundamental about liberal democracy, that it's not sustained by us all agreeing with each other, but by arguing. Healthy debate is the only way in which our liberal democracies can arrive at the truth. In one of his famous Forgotten People broadcasts, he put it plainly: if truth is to emerge and in the long run be triumphant, the process of free debate, the untrammelled clash of opinion, must go on. So it's sort of a bracing idea, isn't it? Not that debate is inconvenient or something to be managed, but it is the very mechanism by which truth is discovered. And yet, if you have a look around at public life today, one's entitled to ask, are we still committed to that ideal? In our increasingly partisan and fractious world, are we even bothering to try and arrive at the truth anymore? Or are both sides just so convinced of their moral and intellectual superiority that they refuse to listen to the opinions of others? What are the flow-on consequences for society and democracy if compromise and understanding have been abandoned in the name of hollow point scoring? What can we do to revive the lost art of listening sincerely to those with whom we disagree? Well, to explore these questions and no doubt much more, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Leila Brammer, who's Director of Outreach and Instructional Development of the Parrhesia Program for Public Discourse at the University of Chicago. This program is dedicated to fostering vigorous, inclusive and productive public discourse, teaching students not what to think, that's important I think, but how to argue, to listen and engage seriously with opposing views. Welcome, Leila, to Afternoon Light Live here. For the first time, we're holding an Afternoon Light Live in the old council chambers in the old quadrangle.
Thank you so much for having me, and what a beautiful space this is.
It is stunning, steeped in history. Leila, you've come from Chicago. We've just been discussing before, quite a democratic city. I think you were saying they voted in the last presidential election about 80% for Kamala Harris. But tell me, for us looking from Australia at the US, it looks a pretty divided body politic. What do you think the quality of public debate is like in the US?
The quality of public debate has certainly diminished, and I don't think there was some sort of golden age of Camelot, but certainly over the opening decades of this century, we have moved further and further away from having those debates. I do want to come back to the premise of your statement, though. I do not believe that I come from a divided United States. And we talk about it internally, and I know you all talk about it externally. And it's maybe easy if you watch the media or you get on social media to believe that we have some nation that's divided 50-50 and we're no longer talking to one another. I think the story is much more complex than that. And let me just give you two instances. In Florida and in Montana, both deeply red states now, Trump won with supermajority, about 75% of the vote. In both states on the same ballot are state amendment to the Constitution of the state for reproductive rights. And imagine the lift it takes to get a state amendment passed, right? In both of those states, more people are voting for a constitutional amendment than are voting for Donald Trump. That tells me something really interesting about an electorate. And you can see it in the polling as well. It's not quite a simple story to tell. First of all, we don't have mandatory voting. So about 50% are staying home. And of that 50% staying home, they're agreeing with a lot of the other voters that they don't like either choice, right? And so they're making some complex calculus about which of the worst they're going to choose. And so that ends up with a very different electorate than a parliamentary system where people might come and vote and have some different ways of doing that. And many of those voters end up being then one-issue voters as well in the United States electorate. And so I think it's just much more complex. And when I'm out talking with people, and I've made it my goal in the last decade to go out and talk to citizens around the country, people are much more in that middle ground of agreeing with one party on this and the other party on another thing and trying to work through issues and come to some different conclusions on things, but we don't have a place for them to stand. There isn't a platform for them to speak.
So that's interesting. At a sort of everyday person level, it might not be nearly as divided as we see on the television. But of course, we're in Australia, so all we see is the television. The way your politicians, your media personalities engage with each other, I mean, I speak from my own perspective, but presumably there are a few others who might share this view. It seems pretty divided. There isn't a lot of coming together around at least a core set of issues that faces the United States. This is an electorate, at least at the public level, the public advocate level, that does seem divided. Do you think that the level of discourse is poorer quality in its history, or do you think that perhaps we're just more sort of attentive to it?
So in this century, those positions on the left and right of American politics have become much more entrenched. And one of the big issues of that, if you're on the left and work with the right, you've betrayed some cause. And if you're on the right and work with the left, you've betrayed some cause. And then it's no doubt, as you're looking at American politics, we have stagnated on issues. We really can't get anything done as far as legislation because of that stagnation and an inability to work with one another. And I know this is before the time of some people in the audience, but Ronald Reagan, a Republican president, used to have lunch every week with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and they had a civic friendship. They could not disagree more about what would be the best way to advance America's future. But every week they got together and they talked about it over lunch. And we've lost that idea of civic friendship and how to do that work. I would also argue that entrenchment really leaves out, there is no place for someone to make an argument that's not an entrenched position. Like if you were to say, well, I kind of like them both, or I don't like either, you get smacked from both sides of that. And so social media is never going to have that place for like a middle to talk. The media, it's kind of a boring story to tell in our football analogy that we have for how we talk about our politics. There's just not a place where a common person, even in the United States, would know that there's a big middle unless you start going out and talking to people.
Now, Leila, what can we put this down to? Is it social media? I always think that's a bit of a cop-out, personally, saying, all our problems are to do with social media, mental health, social media, can't find common ground, social media, war in Iran, let's say, social media. I mean, is that the explanation, or is there something deeper here?
Again, there isn't a Camelot perfect time, but in the United States, really this starts in the 1980s with the deregulation of the media that opens up a cable news network. And before that, if you lived in the United States, you were getting your news on air, whether it was local or national, and you would get the same rather vanilla news, and it didn't matter which of the four stations you listened to, you could still have a conversation because you had a shared experience of public life. Yep. Then with cable news and the development of Fox News, news became partisan. And so there were different views that people were getting from Fox News, and then MSNBC arrives to give an entrenched position on the other side. And people now get to choose their own news channel and choose where they're going to have the view of public life, so that we can't have a discussion about what happened because we don't have even a shared information ecosystem. So that happens there. Then you move it into an online world, right? And the social confirmation that comes from social media platforms that further entrenches people, that we just aren't even in conversation anymore with people who might have opposing positions other than to lob bombs at them and think that they are some sort of evil. And that happens on both sides of our political divide.
I'm attracted to that argument, but when you look at history and you think, pre-TV, even pre-radio, there were so many newspapers you could access. And if you were a communist in Australia, you had the Tribune and you would read that. And if you were, maybe a Melbourne banker, you might read the Melbourne Age. You had so many different sources of information from which to choose that, you could curate your sources of information. Was it as polarizing back then as it is today? Was there a perfect point where we had these, very few sources of authoritative information that meant we were a more cohesive society? I find it a bit puzzling that we are saying, oh, well, cable news, curated content, listening to what we agree with, therefore creates silos, therefore we're polarised, therefore we're where we are. It just doesn't quite satisfy me.
There are many other reasons. And remember when I noted there wasn't a Camelot? There are elections that happened in the United States in the 1800s that are just as divisive as the elections that have happened in 2016, 2020, and 2024, right? Just as divisive, just as ugly, maybe even uglier things said. And they happened in the press that is the print press, which I also think required that you read and knew more about the issues. I think there's a signaling that has happened also in our information ecosystem of what kind of good information that we get, right? So it doesn't matter which one of those cable news networks I choose. I don't think any of them provide me the information I need as a citizen to make decisions. And they've made it quick, and they've made my attention span even smaller. And if I'm on social media, it's just a meme or a 15-second clip. And so I don't know that we have the information available for me to adjudicate as a citizen who would be the best candidate for my interests. And I think that's something where we can see an information ecosystem already on a bipartisan election piece that we already have that has made that worse and worse.
There's some suggestion that the problem with our, social division and lack of ability to find common ground and disagree well is that we've lost those common anchors in our society. So religion, centralised media, or some sort of authoritative source. Do you think that those anchors like religion, and I appreciate you're coming from the US perspective, which is very different context to Australia. We're a much more secular society than the United States, but we really are seeing very, very low levels of religious affiliation when you see survey data of Australia. So people, they might agree on, they follow the football or, those sorts of Australian religions, but 100 years ago, you would meet at church, you would agree on, the belief in God and the values that come through Christian teachings, whereas today you can't take those things for granted.
I think that's part of a problem, and I will extend it beyond churches. This is a problem of losing those third spaces in democracy where we might meet somebody who differs or disagrees with us. Another thing that has happened in the last few decades in the United States is people have moved so that they are essentially living in neighborhoods that are very partisan neighborhoods, right? And so now even when I'm talking across the fence or at a bus stop, I am not talking with people who might challenge my positions. I don't go to church. I don't go to maybe a third hall, a Lions Club or a Rotary Club. Those have dried up as well. And so there just aren't those civic spaces where we might make civic friendships where we can have those conversations. I always talk about John Dewey. He's an American philosopher of education. In 1927, he wrote a book called The Public and Its Problems. And he says our main problem as a public is we need better means of debate and discourse. And he's already seen that nearly 100 years ago, right? And it's taken off further from then. And we spend more time in our houses and we spend more time on our phones. Even when we are out in what might be a third space, we're buried in our phones rather than meeting the people at the bus stops and having conversations about the issues of the day.
Yeah, the irony of us being so highly connected is that we are becoming more disconnected.
And more lonely and more isolated. And I do think that loneliness and isolation also feeds into our tribalism, because then we might find a home in a political party that looks a lot like a football affiliation, right? And I can wear the gear of it and have a sense of pride in it.
What sparked your interest in civic debate? Because this has been a lifelong interest for you, hasn't it? Even as a child, you had an interest in debate and rhetoric.
And certainly I grew up a working class in South Dakota, in the third largest city in the state, 19,000 people. And my dad was an appliance repair person, so he was always out in the community talking with people across, all sorts of race, class, and differences and disagreements. And so my mom was really involved in the church. And so I grew up in a milieu that we were having those conversations at the dinner table. We were having those conversations out in society. In a town of 19,000, you can't hide, right? And so people know who you are, and your reputation and ethos matter. And it prepared me well for the world. And I could have chosen lots of paths. But when in college, I decided I would study rhetoric because I could study everything else because of it. And I really thought I was going to be able to crack the code of persuasion. So I entered in to do that and thought I could do that best by studying social movements and how they might get their voices heard in mainstream politics.
So, one of the great, persuaders of our age has been Donald J. Trump. We were just talking before about his public speaking skills, his ability to read an audience. He, can really move a crowd in his direction. What is his secret sauce, Leila?
His secret sauce, and I think there's something to learn here. I always push back when people tell me that he's unskilled, he doesn't know what he's doing. I don't know that he knows what he's doing. I don't know he could tell you or teach someone what he's doing. But what he has done and has worked really well with his base is tell a story to them. Imagine a guy who comes down an escalator in Manhattan in 2015 that no one thought had a chance, gets a base, not in Manhattan, New York, but Manhattan, Kansas. Somehow he's able to go talk and tell a story of disenfranchisement to people, working class people and farmers and others in rural areas that sticks. And he tells that story in a way that he blames an elite for it. They were already feeling that. It's an easy jump for them to take that on. And then for those of you who are thinking, well, his speeches don't even make sense. How is that possible? He does a really interesting trick, and I don't think he does it on purpose necessarily, but Aristotle argued that the most powerful type of persuasion is what he called enthymeme, the unfulfilled syllogism, that you lay out premises and you let your audience come to conclusions because we persuade ourselves. And what Donald Trump has done in creating his base is he can talk a bunch of word salad that makes no sense on paper or makes no sense when you're listening it, but every single member of his base fills in that argument for him, and they fill it in different ways. So if you talk to his base, and I do, they're like, that was a great speech. He said this. That was a great speech. He said that. They have different things that they're drawing from it, but each one of them has made the argument in their own head and can articulate the argument he made. And so for those people who are out there, dismissing him obviously is not a good way of beating him. If you want to beat him, you need to have as good a ground game as he does and get outside the echo chamber of DC and go talk to people in rural America who really do feel left behind. And we talk about it as flyover country because people just fly over us and go to the coasts. And when we think of the coasts as elite, how do you bring your policies back down and start talking about them as a level of people? Politics is about making people's lives better. So how do you take your policies and put them on the ground in rural America, in failing cities that are drying up in the Northeast? How do you go talk to the people again?
One of the American presidents that Donald Trump admires, and he invokes a lot of his rhetoric, is Ronald Reagan. And he was a great orator as well. But he nailed the art of an amazing speech. Great speechwriters, of course, were helping him. You studied the art of rhetoric. You study political campaigning and how communications is so important in that. But what was it about Ronald Reagan that made him so successful in debates and speeches? Was it his acting background or good looks, charm, jokes, great jokes? Great jokes.
All of that counts, but he was a really good speaker prior to him becoming an actor. He'd had a really good training in high school. He was really involved in all sorts of leadership activities at Dixon, Illinois High School on the west side of Illinois. And then he becomes an actor and he really hones a craft. craft of being able to talk to an audience and do so in ways that people can listen. He has the best speechwriters, and they are the best speechwriters because they knew what the message was and they were writing to his message. And he would look over his speeches and often never change a word, but always sign them with an RR. Sometimes he would change a word or two, but they got him and they could write for him, and then he could deliver it and knock it out of the park as far as delivery. One of the things he did, and again, it's an thematic move, is he would tell these stories, right? He would say, economic policy. I was talking to Polly in Philadelphia last week, and she was telling me about, right? And all of a sudden, all of us live our own experiences over this narrative of Polly in Philadelphia. And so we feel like we have a president who knows us as well. And so it was this really flattened form of presidential discourse that we hadn't seen. We'd had presidents talk down at us. Ronald Reagan's feels a little flatter that he's talking with us. And, whether you agree or disagree with Ronald Reagan, those are really great speeches.
What was it? He said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I loved that line.
And that was not planned. So
So he actually did come up with that himself.
Yeah, he's probably riffed on it in different ways, but that moment itself is one that
Brilliant.
he uses it. He just has he had this really great sense of humor, much like a Kennedy, just this wicked sense of humor that he could bring into a moment.
So you're at a university, the University of Chicago. It's a really interesting university from a free speech perspective, from a public discourse perspective. 1967, I hope I've got that right, or 68, it adopted the policy of institutional neutrality, which is a pretty foreign concept, I think, for us in Australia. The idea that a tertiary institution, but even a big public company or a media institution would not take a position on a social or political issue as a matter of policy, as a real institutional value. We saw in the Voice campaign here in 2022, institutions, organisations taking positions on that political issue way out of the realms of an issue that would have affected their core business. The University of Chicago doesn't do that, obviously, it's neutral. What is the basis for adopting a policy of institutional neutrality?
So the University of Chicago is rare among institutions, I think, throughout the world. It was founded to become one of the great research universities of the world. That was its impetus. And it's founded rather late for those types of institutions in the early 1890s. And it was founded with an idea, if we're going to do that, we need to have full and free academic inquiry. And that requires freedom of expression. And those documents, that articulation of that starts in 1899. The president and the congregation of faculty, as they were called, have a unanimous declaration of free and full expression by faculty. 2, it will never be questioned. I always say it should be interrogated. And 3, the university won't enter into lawsuits. That's in 1899. That thread comes through in that 1967 Calvin report, which says the role of the university in social political action is not to take a stand. The actors of the university, they called these sponsored critics, the assembly of faculty and students, they are the critics. They are the social political actors, and they take stands. With a notion, if the university were to take a stand, they might quash the type of robust and vigorous debate that has to happen on campus, and also quash maybe the stands that were being taken or should be taken by social and political actors out in the world. As I explain it, and I just like to put it in 7 words, the university doesn't take stands, so you can. And it is that notion of, I said this earlier, why are we looking to institutions to take stands for us? We are the public. We should be out there taking stands on the issues of the day that matter to us, and not looking to our retail stores or our airlines or our institutions to take those stands for us.
Do you find that the quality of debate and disagreement at the University of Chicago is better substantially than other universities because of this type of policy?
I do, and it's hard for me to say that, right?
Yeah, true. I mean, you're basically employed to say that. So, tell us why it is true.
I'm a sponsored critic, so I could indeed criticize if I wish to. I do find that way, but also note that that is such a part of the ether of the University of Chicago. And then our student recruitment is also based on that. So we're bringing together students who are doing that. Many of them write essays talking about how they believe in free speech and free expression. And maybe they're doing that as a marketing campaign, but they literally have to write about it, right? Still, they're still choosing to write about it. And they expect that when they come to a class at the University of Chicago, that the discussions are going to be vigorous, that if they make a statement, they will be challenged. And that is just part of that education piece. And I invite you all to come visit. There are these great coffee shops that I promise you, if you stand in line or you sit in the coffee shops, you will hear the most vigorous ongoing discussions of issues of the day, of issues of the past, and also, some things that are happening in the media realm as well, but always vigorously debated.
A big issue, of course, in the last few years has been rising anti-Semitism in Australia, but you've seen that, of course, in the States and I think across many parts of the world. We've seen pro-Palestinian protests and then Jewish students feeling under threat on campus and Jewish people more broadly in Australian society. How do you curate a debate around that issue where I think most institutions try and just excise it and not deal with it because it's just too hot to handle?
It is a really difficult issue. I mean, just think through it of trying to curate a debate. And to get back to something I said earlier, I think the loud, entrenched positions have really squeezed out what I'm hearing from most people I talk to. And that is there are some really nuanced, interesting positions out there that we're just not hearing from. And I would want to have a discussion that would do that. And maybe I can give you an example. We had the former Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority come as one of our events at the Forum for Free Inquiry and Expression. And we started it with an exercise run by one of our behavioral scientists at the Booth School for Business. And we did an exercise where each one of us in the room was supposed to turn to a neighbor and talk about our views on, and he gave us this little bit of a script, and talk about our views on Israel and Palestine. And then he gave us a survey afterwards about that experience. And of course, but it's interesting, it was off the charts because people hadn't had a chance to express opinions and express them in a way that they felt comfortable to not take one of the deep stances on that. Then the former Prime Minister came out, and there were, as I might expect, 2 times during that interview with him where it was interrupted by protesters. And both times, protest is a violation of free expression because you're shutting off someone else's free expression. And both times that was stated from the platform, and both times students were removed from the auditorium. But it continues. And what an opportunity to listen to a former prime minister talk about the history of the conflict and also how he might think about what could be done to move this forward.
We are now at 2:30, which means we're opening up to our audience questions. This one's from Dennis O'Day. He agrees US institutions remain strong and that the left and right do agree on some issues. His question relates to the disconnect between the leadership of the Democratic Party with its constituency, which, you may have a view on, given you work with political activists. Yeah.
I think I spoke to that earlier on this. The Democratic Party, at least historically, had always been a party of the working class and labor unions and that kind of middle America piece. And this is, again, my opinion. I'm speaking only for myself in my own study of this. They lost their way and moved to Washington and became looking like an established elite that was talking down to rather than talking with Americans in rural America and working class Americans in cities. And so I would agree that they lost their way and they lost their base, and it made a opportunity for someone else to come in and take that base from them.
Yeah, but I guess an opportunity too for someone to take over the Republican Party as well.
Right.
Not a sort of a natural inheritor of Republican Party traditions is Donald Trump. Our next question is from Stuart Gill, former Master of Queen's College, and I know you know him from your previous visit to Melbourne University, Leila. Stuart asks, the headline in Canada today, University of British Columbia leads the way on civil discourse. A successful debate series places universities at centre stage in ending polarisation. This is presented as if it is something new. Should it not be at the heart of what all universities do?
I could not agree more.
I'd say we'd call this a Dorothy Dixon, Leila. I don't know if you have that term in the United States. It's a question set up perfectly for you to answer, basically.
And the same thing happens in the US. Every time someone does something where they have students talking, for me, it's the one that's like, professor leads class in which all students talk about their viewpoints. And I'm like, well, that is exactly what we should be doing in teaching. And it's happening across the country and it's happening in different places. And I'm going to say this on the record because universities have this need to have the kind of media campaigns to get themselves known for stuff. It gets pumped out also through PR campaigns. And it has some traction because the public doesn't believe that's happening on US campuses. And we have not told that story very well. If they thought that was happening everywhere, it wouldn't be a news story. It is indeed happening everywhere, but we're not telling the story well.
Do you think university campuses have changed?
I think they've definitely changed. I'm not saying that everything is wonderful on university campuses, and certainly because I would say higher education was weak, because we've lost our messaging, because of multiple pressures in the United States, they were vulnerable for someone like Trump to come in and impose things upon them, right? And there isn't a public that had an outcry over any of those impositions, right? Because we had lost a public. We were no longer felt like, the public doesn't feel like we're serving them.
Yeah.
And so I think campuses have changed. They are different. But on campuses, I can't imagine any campus where there's not a lot of great teaching happening. That the majority of what's happening is really great. And now telling the story makes it feel like it's a one-off as opposed to what's really happening in the ether of most college campuses.
I think it's interesting, and sorry, it's not my turn to ask questions, but I'm going to, having host prerogative here. More and more people in our society go to university than ever before. I mean, we have a highly educated population here in Australia, and yet the connection that people feel with universities and that sense that they have social license to do the things they do is dissipating. So, as you say, when universities are bashed in the media, no one's standing up there to defend them. And yet, I mean, everyone in this room has been to a university or is at a university. So it's quite an extraordinary disconnect between those who have the experiences of the universities not actually fighting for their existence or their value.
And we haven't concerted that. I think people might and would, but why haven't we concerted our public through our alumni associations and have them out there in their businesses and professions and across fences talking about the value of universities, even just the university they went to. They might talk about it in the United States in football or basketball, but they're not necessarily talking about their pride in the innovation and research that their universities are bringing. They are just out there. Talk about a PR campaign waiting to happen. They're out there for us to utilize to help spread the message of the value of an education.
But I think it's because the reputation is that there's groupthink at universities. It's highly biased to one side of politics and against the other, that the universities aren't out there for the national interest. They're there for a narrow sector's interests.
And certainly, it's hard to defend because there's a lot of examples out there of what you just argued, right? Again, I think for the most part, most universities have really great teaching and have alumni who are really committed and have favorite professors back at those universities. Why aren't we telling those stories and using that to spread the mission of, I learned this, but I learned this at this university. It was part of my college education. And I don't know about you all, but our alumni association is very involved. And why aren't we using them to be a voice in helping us through these crises across the United States?
Question here from James Gray. Thanks, James. He's a person I know who believes in vigorous debate and discussion. He has asked, we have vigorous discussion, but how can we have civil discourse at the same time? It is an important distinction, isn't it?
It is indeed. Yeah. And I really believe, I use the word productive because I worry about civil because we've used it to then say that the other side is not civil. And I want to really talk about how we can have productive discourse. And that starts with us having vigorous places that we're going to disagree. But maybe we're not going to do it in that same old mode of two-sided type of debate and yelling at each other or the social media confirmation bias. What if, in entering into those conversations where we disagree, instead of entering with statements and arguments and getting angry, we enter into those places where we disagree with questions. Tell me more. You don't agree with me on this issue. I'd like to know more about what has brought you there. What experiences have you had? I have those conversations out in the United States all the time. Almost always when I have a conversation like that, I get it mirrored back to me. We're primates. And I learn about other people's positions, and they get to learn about my positions. And maybe at the end of the day, we don't agree, but we both have a better understanding of our own position and those of others. And I can't call you evil anymore because I've sat down and I understand your rationale for why you do that. That's a starting point. And if we can do those types of conversations, and I do those in local communities and in the classroom, we can reweave a fabric of democracy that I think exists at a local level. The fabric of democracy is us, the people. And we can weave connections across our communities and create a more resilient democracy. And we each have the ability to do that, to create a more connected local democracy.
Do you think there are some cultures that are better at productive disagreement? I mean, I just think sometimes in Australia we are very polite. We have this pretense that we're larrikins and, it's all sort of jokes and bluff and bluster. But actually we try and skirt around major disagreements, and we have this democracy of manners, the historian John Hirst, Australian historian John Hirst used to call it. And so it's a way of getting on in a pluralist society to agree on, we follow sport or the weather or the like. But say if it's politics, religion or sex, let's just leave them unsaid. Whereas you see some other cultures, and, this is huge stereotypes here, but I think Southern Europeans, they're great arguers. They love arguing. It's a national sport. And yet Australians go, a bit feisty. I mean, is it a cultural phenomenon?
It definitely has cultural places to it. And depending on your culture, we might have to teach you better to argue.
Yeah.
So in Italy, yes, they love to argue, but have they moved to the type of things that would lead toward productive kind of agreements? Maybe, maybe not, right? Yeah. But at least we have some argument happening. I spent most of my adult life in Minnesota. Our statement is Minnesota nice. And so if somebody says something you disagree with, you say, oh, that's interesting, right? And so you would never disagree in that sort of way. And so my students in Minnesota, I really had to move them to even make statements, let alone agree in an argument. So yeah, there are cultural pieces of that. And yet across culture, when you look at the studies and research of people engaging in difference and disagreement, it is just amazing. People get a great deal of joy out of it. They have really increased well-being for engaging in these type of conversations. They're hungry for more of them if they can engage in a way that feels comfortable for them. And that I will say that two-sided debate, for those of you who are really good at it, you really love it. 80% of the population hates it, and they're not going to engage you in that. So the asking of questions, if we can do that question asking and get to know each other, the research on that is just remarkable about how much joy people get out of it, how much learning people get out of it, and the well-being effects of even just one of those conversations are sticky. They last for about 2 weeks, right? And it fires up some pieces of receptors in our brain that are addictive. So it probably is something that wouldn't be approved by a drug company if they made it, but it would be $1 billion a day industry. And each of us can do it. We can put down our phone and have conversations with the people around us and really learn more about their viewpoints and where they come from and their experiences. And we're getting well-being, they're getting well-being, and we're creating a learning environment for all of us.
Oh, well, it's something for all of us to take home and try and see if our well-being shoots up. A question here, it's a US political question. Trump operates at 2 levels, entertainer Trump or troll Trump. 15 years of The Apprentice prepared him for that. Strategist Trump listened to what he has said from the 80s. His views are well developed and they're consistent. Commentators don't understand that Trump has been strategically positioning himself for 40 plus years. Trump does not speak to curated, pre-drafted talking points. Please expand on the importance of communication skills. So similar perhaps to our previous interrogation of the Trump communication skills.
Yeah, definitely. And it adds a layer that I hadn't talked about. He's an entertainer, right? Do you want to listen to someone standing behind a podium reading a script off a teleprompter and very rarely looking at an audience? Or do you want to listen to the guy who's unpredictable and in the moment might say something that is unimaginable and then the next moment say something totally else that's unimaginable, right? If you're a member of his base, listening to him speak is the greatest entertainment, and it brings them great joy in doing so, and they're filling in the gaps. And Trump has certainly found a market for it with his base. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, we certainly haven't had a political leader fill stadiums in recent history. I know there's lots of people who experienced Robert Menzies in the 60s who, as children, who'll come and say to me, I went to this town hall meeting and heard him speak, and it was absolutely packed to the rafters. He made jokes. He was really entertaining. He'd debate members of the audience. But these days in Australia, that's a completely unfamiliar phenomenon. Politicians are not, I think, as committed to the art of oratory as they may have been in the past.
And what Trump captures, and Reagan did in a different way, and most successful politicians in the United States, is an authenticity. Yeah. It is absolutely authentic. And imagine, again, you have the politician reading off a script. Is that authentic? Is that what they really believe? I can always walk away from what Trump says and know that that is exactly what he believed in that moment. It is authentic. And that authenticity, by the way, if you're looking for speaking hints, it is wicked. If you can find your voice and your authentic connection with an audience, it really is a powerful experience. And that's what Donald Trump has done.
Clearly, the art of presidential communication has inspired our audience. So yet another question on this topic from Michael Stewart. How would you compare the communication skills of Trump and Obama? I mean, both very, very good orators.
And another one who could fill a stadium, right? In a very different way. Obama studied speeches, right? He is someone who he studied delivery, he worked on it and developed a voice that had a great deal of authenticity. Imagine a very young Obama at the 2004 Democratic National Convention making his entrance on the scene. He's not even a member of Congress yet. He's running to be a member of Congress and giving just a knockdown, great convention speech that we can still talk about. And then using those skills to catapult over the Democratic Party. He wasn't supposed to be there in 2008, right? He catapults over other people and becomes president of the United States in what would be seen as really remarkable fashion. I'll be controversial, even though I'm being recorded. Some of his speeches...
Your secret's safe with our YouTube followers.
His speeches, and I'm teaching rhetoric, and I'm teaching rhetoric during the time that he's giving speeches. Some of his speeches are really amazing, and they draw in audience, and some of his speeches are dull. And you can tell the ones where he wrote them and he's involved in them and the ones where he's reading off. And one of them, if you want to look at it, he gives a speech on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. So the Dr. Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, he's got the 50th anniversary of this speech, right, on the Washington Mall. And he gives a pretty dull speech on housing policy. What a missed moment for someone of his oratorical gift, and think about how that should have been one of those memorable moments in life. Yeah. But pretty much when he has that memorable moment, he's written it or he's riffed or he's gone off script. The memorial service where he sings Amazing Grace, that's an off script moment. He has a tremendous skills. It's when he gets confined by his speechwriters who didn't write for his voice like Ronald Reagan's speechwriters wrote for his voice.
Yeah, well, look, I must say I don't agree with many of the Obama policies, but I found myself many times over swept away by his oratory. It was quite magnificent. Question here, can universities be both encouraging activism and free inquiry? And I think my addendum to that question would be, what do you think of the academic activist? Because that is a phenomenon we see here in Australia. No doubt you have them in the US.
I'll start with students.
Yep.
Certainly as part of having open free expression, it is an encouragement for students to take stands. I think that's as written in the Calvin report when we're talking about we sponsor critics and it's up to critics to take stands. It's almost also not just an invitation, but almost an obligation to be a political and social actor and take stands. And that might lead you to activism as students. And we certainly support the idea of students protesting and being part of protest and critiquing the university and institutions. Again, this is going to be a personal viewpoint of mine. Academic freedom is such as a freedom to take where your discipline allows you to inquiry and to teach in the area that you want to do inquiry. I really believe that that's really important for me. And I would argue, I hope for other faculty who see themselves as active, I would not put myself in that category, but for faculty who see themselves as activist teachers, they're doing it in a way that they're creating what we should be doing at universities. Our role is not to tell students what to think, but how to think. And so I always start my classes, I don't care what you think. I want you to make an argument and really challenge me. If I were going to write what I believed, I would write it myself. So write something that challenges me and make the strongest argument for your viewpoints, and I'm going to help you be better in strong argument. That's my role at a university. And so when that activist teaching moves over into telling students what to think and not engaging them in the tensions and having them come to their own conclusions, for me, again, personal opinion, that worries me. And I think our role is very clear that in the classroom, my role is teaching students how to think well and make strong arguments, no matter what those arguments are.
What about in fields like history, though, where there's events, they're factual, but their interpretation is contested? I wonder, where does the line get drawn between truth and the search for truth and opinion? Because I think in a lot of the liberal arts, the humanities, that is lost, and an activist, academic, a tutor, a lecturer can push an opinion that a student who is in the process of learning about this stuff might find very difficult to work out what's opinion and what's factual evidence, and how can I form my own opinions when I'm not even sure what the ground rules are here.
History is a discipline. And it has disciplinary requirements of how one makes an argument in history. And certainly, even among historians that are well-known, well-recognized, and well-respected, they might have some different takes on particular political events because they've researched them in different ways. That is phenomenal. That is what history should do. And that's what a classroom should do, is to bring in those different viewpoints from well-respected historians and have students work through how history is written, how arguments are made, and help them come to their own conclusion. Teach students how to be good historians, not teach them what the history is.
A question here from our audience, and it is interesting, your context from the United States versus here in Australia is so influenced by your Constitution, of course, your First Amendment. And I think that colours the sort of democratic culture of America versus the culture here in Australia. So the questioner asks, is instituting free speech in the Constitution the only way to protect free speech?
I don't think it has to be. But remember, I'm coming from the United States and I'm coming with this embodiment and some institutional and occupational psychosis to it. So maybe there are different methods of doing it, but having it written into a constitution as the First Amendment, I said earlier, it started as the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution when there were about 13 different pieces of the Bill of Rights they were talking about. It moves up to first. It is primary. That idea of free expression, free assembly, free religion, free press, those are primary values, and to have them encapsulated in the Constitution provides constitutional protection from presidents and Congress that would try to take those away from the people. So I like it that it's there, but I'm open to the fact there might be other ways of doing it.
I mean, Robert Menzies opposed a Bill of Rights more broadly when there were debates around it. And it is a recurring debate in Australia. The view is really that you put it into legislated form or constitutional form one day, and then 100 years hence, are they the values that your society at that time hold dear? And actually, shouldn't Parliament, or in your case Congress, be sovereign and decide on the laws of the land at the time reflecting the will of the people? So there's an element of flexibility. But you're stuck with something that's, 250 years old?
We are indeed. But two responses to that. Those are civil liberties, and the idea that a democracy cannot hold unless there's free expression of the people. And two, I would not want to put that value in the hands of Congress or the executive branch at any moment, certainly not at this moment when they can't get anything done. I'm not sure that they're doing the will of the people on anything. And for them to hold a civil liberty.
Well, and if I can invoke Robert Menzies here, he would say that a parliament that got rid of free speech would show a democracy at its very knees, and that there was something a lot more, more serious going on that would lead a parliament to that point, and that you may as well give up on the whole democratic project. So, I would argue that your Congress would struggle to get to that point if the health of American democracy was.
I'm not so sure about that.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just this moment. I think there were other moments where Congress would have maybe infringed on free expression. And that would worry me. But the other thing is, we came out of a very different piece, right? We are declaring independence. We have a failure of our first form of government that hasn't worked out for us. We now have a new constitution. And what are the things we want to protect ourselves from? We want to protect ourselves against all the civil liberties that we saw violated by the British against us. And we want to make sure that our government, whatever government, the people writing the Constitution are really worried about government. That's why Articles of Confederation failed, because they made it so loose. They worry so much about government. That's why presidents weren't given power, right? That's why we have these term limits. Huge concern about government. And so let's make sure that the government can't do these things, because we hadn't, and it was an experiment. We were launching something new upon the globe, and we just were trying to figure out how to do it right.
Yeah.
I wouldn't
and we're lucky because we learnt from the American experience and didn't, of course, have the violent war of independence against the British like you had to go through. So we got the sort of peaceful resolution, right, and picked the good bits of your system and the British system, and we're obviously the perfect country.
No, and I think that's a really, to be founded late is not such a bad idea, right? You get to do that. And then that might mean that you don't need to declare these pieces. But for the U.S. experiment, I would argue at the time they had to be declared, and I'm glad they are there.
Yeah, and then you look at the mother of parliaments, of course, the British Parliament, and the laws they're passing at the moment. And we won't go down that rabbit hole because we have 3 minutes to go. But I mean, the infringements on civil liberties in Britain at the hands of their parliament, I think, is quite terrifying. A quick question from James Gray. Can you suggest a book or article to read that covers what you're saying? Something pithy.
Something pithy. You know what I would send you, and if I had copies for everyone, I'd give them out to you. But the place I'll send you to is the University of Chicago you can just Google University of Chicago Free Expression. And what you'll find there is the documents, and you can read through themselves, and you can get a little bit of that history and that flavor of how that works. And then my boss, our faculty director, Tom Ginsberg, has co-authored a volume that collects the documents and other documents at the University of Chicago. They call it the Chicago Canon, that has some of that history, and that might be an interesting read for others, and you can find it on the website. And again, if I had books for everyone, I would give them out. I
know the luggage limitations are pretty stringent coming from the US, so we'll forgive you on this occasion. I think that the final question here, its time is upon us, is about offensive speech. In Australia, we have laws against offensive speech. You can't have those laws because of your First Amendment. How are we supposed to deal with offensive speech? And you have 1 minute to answer that.
So in the U.S., we don't have hate speech laws. We don't have an idea in jurisprudence of harm of speech. Those are just not legal terminologies for us. And the idea around bad speech hateful speech, as I might call it, is you need to speak more, and that's the counter speech. So when you hear offensive speech, then it's upon us in the community to call out that offensive speech and make a stronger argument. And that is how we operate as a university, and I think at our best how we operate as a country.
A wonderful discussion, Leila. Thank you so much for joining us on Afternoon Light. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.